Welcome to session 20 of the Simple course. 2 weeks ago, we began discussing stress and its impact on the fight and flight instinctual system. Today, we will discuss the post-traumatic stress spectrum disorders, including developmental trauma, which is trauma that occurs in the formative years, and the most well-known trauma spectrum disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, commonly known as PTSD. To watch our introductory video entitled The Body Keeps the Score, please pause this video now and open session 20 on the website itsimple2021.com. This video presents the work of eminent trauma specialist Bessel van de Kolk. Next are your usual reminders directed mostly at people doing the course in a group. Please take a few moments to read these on your own. To watch this week's mindfulness practice video entitled Visualize the End Result, please go to the website now. For people doing the YouTube course as part of a group, you can now pause for questions, comments, or feedback. Let's start with a quick overview of the course. We started by claiming that we see the world not as it is, but as we are. As we are has in part to do with our nervous system's activation states. We also discussed the integral stages of development: archaic, tribal, warrior, traditional, modern, postmodern, integral, and how they affect how we see ourselves and the world. We then also discussed attachment types: secure, insecure, and disorganized, and how they too affect how we see ourselves and the world. Today, we will start exploring another lens through which we see ourselves and the world, the lens of the fight-flight instinct, as we consider how the fight-flight brain system is affected by traumatic stressors. Note that next week we'll review session 21 of the Simple Manual, which gives examples of how to use the Goals Diary card. We can go over those examples, but we prefer to practice the Goals Diary card or any other tool live with participants of the course. Please consider volunteering. You can email us or let us know today or next week. In 2 weeks, we will discuss structural dissociation theory, which will help us understand the traumatic spectrum disorders, PTSD, complex PTSD, and DID, dissociative identity disorder. Here's what we'll do today. Today, we will cover the material presented in session 20 of the Simple Manual. This includes trauma, traumatic stress disorders, childhood trauma, the adverse childhood event studies, implicit and explicit memory, the activation curve, psychiatry's blind spot for trauma, and controversies around memory and trauma. At the midway point, we'll take a break. We'll also have time for discussion. Please rate your homework now. The topic today is the traumatic spectrum disorders, of which PTSD is the most well-known condition. Would it be appropriate to start by looking at the history of PTSD and defining some related terms? Yes, let's start with a brief history of the word trauma. Organisms have, of course, experienced traumatic events for as long as there's been life on Earth. But the first actual mention of the word trauma, along with a description of its symptoms, is found in the 17th century journal of Samuel Pepys, a survivor of the Great London Fire of 1666, which gutted the central parts of that city. In the late 19th century, the word trauma entered everyday usage because of the frequent factory and mine accidents that were a feature of the Industrial Revolution. In World War I, many soldiers involved in combat developed trauma-induced disorders that were referred to as shell shock. These soldiers were thought to be cowards trying to get out of fighting and were promptly sent back to the front. Many were court-martialed or simply shot by their own officers for desertion. PTSD only started to be understood as a legitimate mental health condition during the Vietnam War. The PTSD diagnosis was incorporated into the DSM in 1980. Let's review some terms that we have already looked at 2 weeks ago. Stressor is a physical or psychological challenge to the well being of an organism. Stress is an organism's physiological and psychological reaction to a stressor. Eustress is manageable stress that is beneficial and makes the organism more resilient. This stress is an aversive state of stress to which the organism cannot fully adapt. Traumatic stress occurs when the stressor emotionally overwhelms the individual's coping mechanisms and leads to the traumatic stress spectrum disorders. Traumatic stress is a life-threatening event that is perceived by the experiencer as inescapable. To understand trauma, we need to focus on two aspects of the trauma spectrum disorders. One, the traumatic event, and two, the psychological and functional impact of the event on the person. There are different kinds of traumatic events, including one, single incident trauma, such as a natural disaster or terrorism. Two, complex trauma, related to ongoing abuse such as neglect, emotional, verbal, physical, or sexual abuse. Three, vicarious trauma, resulting from exposure to others experiencing trauma. And four, intergenerational trauma, which is the impact of the trauma passed on from previous generations to the child. How a stressor impacts a person depends on their resources. Individuals with more resources are generally better at coping. Resources include energy reserves, connection to helpful others, healthy social institutions, access to nature, a sense we are contributing to the world, a sense that the world is meaningful, and attachment-related coping skills such as the ability to mentalize, self-soothe, have a healthy sense of self, and healthy relationships. Are the traumatic spectrum disorders related to the fight-flight instinctual system? If so, how? Trauma spectrum disorders and the fight-flight system. Along with seeking and avoidance, lust, attachment, and play, fight-flight is one of the instinctual brain systems. Fight-flight is associated with fear, anger, and related emotions. From birth, each person's fight-flight system is temperamentally different, as are their corresponding fear, anger, emotions, and behaviors. Both in early and later life, environmental influences, including parenting, interact with a person's temperament and further shape the fight-flight system and the anger, fear, emotions, and behaviors into more stable personality traits. Environmental influences can exacerbate or modulate temperament. Secure attachment, for example, might modulate a temperamental disposition to fear or anger. Insecure types of attachment, on the other hand, might exacerbate temperamental dispositions to fear or anger. Chronic stress and traumatic events resulting in post-traumatic stress spectrum disorders can also dysregulate the fight-flight system, contributing to a person's long-term issues with fear and or anger. As I already said, PTSD is the best known of the trauma spectrum disorders. Can you tell us more about it? Let's start by looking at what the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the highly influential compendium of mental disorders and their diagnostic criteria, published by the American Psychiatric Association, says about the trauma-related disorders. The DSM-5 contains a section on trauma spectrum disorders, which it calls trauma and stressor-related disorders. In this section are 5 diagnoses. 1. Reactive attachment disorder. 2. Disinhibited social engagement disorder. 3. Post-traumatic stress disorder. 4. Acute stress disorder. And 5. Adjustment disorders. The diagnosis of PTSD requires A. Experiencing, B. Observing someone else experience, C. Learning of someone close to you experience, or D. Being repeatedly exposed to aversive details of a traumatic, life-threatening event that is followed by 1. Persistent re-experiencing of the event and intrusive symptoms in the form of flashbacks, intrusive thoughts, etc. 2. Avoidance of cues that remind the person of the event, such as people, places, or certain thoughts. 3. alterations in thinking and mood, such as distorted thoughts about the cause and consequences of the trauma. 4, anxiety or hyperarousal symptoms, such as sleep disturbances, being easily startled, etc. And 5, the symptoms have to have lasted for at least 1 month. If the duration is from 3 days to 1 month, it's acute stress disorder. If it's less than 3 days, it's not considered pathological. The list of signs and symptoms associated with PTSD is extensive and includes re-experiencing symptoms, avoidance symptoms, negative changes in cognition and mood, arousal and reactivity, heart palpitations, difficulty breathing, stomach pain and diarrhea, chronic pain or muscle cramps, sleep disturbances, nausea, fainting, or vomiting, irritability or agitation, easily fatigued, difficulty in emotional regulation, depression and severe anxiety, alcohol, medication, or substance abuse, and suicidal thoughts. In epidemiology, a risk factor is a variable associated with an increased risk of having a condition. The size effect describes how significantly a risk factor is associated with a diagnosis. There are a number of risk factors associated with development of PTSD. Remark that the factor on this list with the highest association to PTSD is lack of social supports. Other risk factors include, in order of importance, life stress, trauma severity, other adverse childhood events, low intelligence, childhood abuse, family psychiatric history, low socioeconomic status, and female gender. The most common immediate causes of PTSD differ with gender. For men, they are rape, combat exposure, childhood neglect, and childhood physical abuse. For women, they are rape, sexual molestation, physical attack, and being threatened with a weapon. Sexual assault is unfortunately very common. Less than 10% of all incidents are reported to police. Yet, out of every 100 sexual assaults reported to police in Canada, only 43 lead to charges being laid. 21 go to court, 12 result in a criminal conviction, and 7 result in a custodial sentence. PTSD is sometimes thought of as arising from a single event. In fact, most people who develop PTSD have experienced multiple traumatic events. The more traumatic events a person experiences, the more likely they are to develop PTSD. While 70% of American adults will experience at least one traumatic event, only 20% of those will develop PTSD. 1 in 13 people in the US will develop PTSD at some point in their life. That's an estimated 8 million people. Women are twice as likely to develop PTSD as are men, and up to 20% of veterans and first responders develop PTSD. Indigenous women are 3 to 5 times more likely to be objects of violence than non Indigenous women, and 5 times more likely to die from that violence. Is there a good tool for diagnosing PTSD? One of the best self administered tools for diagnosing PTSD is the Trauma Checklist Adult. It probes into 4 different aspects of the trauma. 1, the nature of the traumatic event. 2, the person's perception of and immediate effects of the event. 3, the symptoms. And 4, the degree of functional impairment. To watch a video on trauma from a polyvagal theory perspective, please go to the website now. Are traumatic spectrum disorders also diagnosed in children? And if so, how are they different than in adults? The trauma spectrum in children. The diagnosis of PTSD can also be made for children 6 years of age or younger who are exposed to life-threatening events, serious injury, or sexual violence. Exposure includes 1, being the victim, 2, being a witness, especially when the victim is a primary caregiver, or 3, learning that the caregiver was the victim. Children are more vulnerable to trauma than adults. Events that are often traumatic to a child may not be as traumatic to adults, for example, being left by a significant figure or serious medical procedures. Caregivers can themselves traumatize children, either directly or through neglect and exposure to predators. As for adults, childhood traumatic events can be brief and single instance, or prolonged and repeated. Prolonged and repeated childhood trauma often leads to DSM diagnosis of 1. Reactive attachment, or 2. Disinhibited social engagement disorders, which overlaps with complex PTSD and dissociative disorders. If a parent abuses or abandons a child, the child doesn't stop loving the parent, they stop loving themselves. Reactive attachment and disinhibited social engagement disorders are present in children by age 5. Reactive attachment disorder. These children present with A. Emotionally withdrawn behavior, B. Social and emotional disturbances such as reduced responsiveness, limited affect, irritability, sadness, and fearfulness, C. Exposure to extremes of insufficient care in the form of social neglect and deprivation, repeated changes in caregivers, or rearing in unusual settings. Disinhibited social engagement disorder. These children present with A. Reduced or absent reticence when interacting with unfamiliar adults, B. Behaviors not limited to impulsivity that include social disinhibited behavior, and C. Exposure to extremes of insufficient care. The reactive attachment and disinhibited social engagement disorders are due to developmental trauma and overlap very significantly with the concept of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Trauma in children is also known as developmental trauma. One particularly damaging type of developmental trauma is attachment trauma. The term developmental trauma refers to trauma that occurs when the child or adolescent is going through the earlier stages of psychosocial development. Children and adolescents are particularly vulnerable to chronic and traumatic stressors because they don't have the same resources as and depend for protection on parental figures who may or may not protect them and who are sometimes the perpetrators of the trauma. Parents who are stressed have more difficulty being attuned to their children and teaching them how to self soothe, which makes these children more vulnerable to stress and trauma. Having a parent who is mentally ill can be traumatic. Children with insecure attachment types are particularly susceptible to stressors. Not only do they have poorer coping skills, which might never have been modeled for them, but they are also less likely to have an attuned and responsive parental figure to protect them from harm. Attachment trauma refers to trauma caused by the parental figure and leads to both attachment and trauma spectrum disorders in children. Any early life stressor that is beyond the capacity of the child to deal with can interfere with psychosocial development, which will then manifest as personality based issues. Because children are so vulnerable, the consequences of trauma in childhood are enormous. Childhood trauma is an event or events that a child finds overwhelmingly distressing or emotionally painful. It often results in lasting mental and physical effects. Some of the long term impacts of childhood trauma include 1. Affects a child's perception of reality, 2. Wires a child's brain to expect danger, 3. Primes fight, flight, and freeze responses to hyperreact, 4. Creates relationship problems, makes it difficult to make friends and maintain relationships, 5. Takes away the child's sense of safety, 6. Increases the stress hormones flowing through the body, 7. Creates a sense of helplessness, 8. Results in serious behavioral problems, 9. Reduces the child's ability to respond, learn, and process information effectively, which can result in school problems, and 10. Causes lasting physical health problems. Early trauma predisposes children to a cascade of trauma, in that their symptoms make it more likely that they will experience trauma again and again. I noticed that the previous slide used the term ACEs. What does that mean? ACE refers to a series of studies known as the Adverse Childhood Events or ACE studies. The ACE studies' principal investigator was Vincent Felitti. The studies were sponsored by the American Health Maintenance and Insurance Organization, Kaiser Permanente, and involved over 17,000 adult patients. Kaiser Permanente was looking for early life risk factors for later life poor physical and mental health. They found that by far the most significant risk factor predicting later life poor physical and mental health was the quantity of adverse childhood experiences the patients had. Adverse childhood experiences or events are common forms of childhood trauma which encompass various forms of physical and emotional abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction experienced in childhood. ACEs have been linked to premature death as well as to various health conditions, including mental disorders. Toxic stress linked to childhood maltreatment is related to a number of neurological changes in the structure of the brain and its function. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, first published in 1998, was the first large scale study to look at the relationship between 10 categories of adversity in childhood and health outcomes in adulthood. When first published, it was largely ignored. Subsequent research is beginning to identify specific biomarkers associated with different kinds of ACEs. The study involved over 17,000 adult patients. What is incredible is that these were middle class San Diegans, 70% white and 70% college educated, not lower socioeconomic status individuals. They all had access to an expensive private health care plan, either paid by their employer, meaning they were working, or paid by themselves, which meant they were reasonably affluent. This begs the question of what the statistics would look like in a less privileged, lower socioeconomic status sample. Adverse childhood events, parenting, and attachment. Adverse childhood events are related to parenting and attachment styles. Adverse childhood events occur more often to children with insecure attachment than they do to those with secure attachment. Adverse childhood events occur more often in families with authoritarian, permissive, and especially uninvolved parenting than they do in those with authoritative parenting. Secure attachment provides not only parental protection, but also teaches emotional regulation, which confers on these children protection from adverse events. Michael Meany, studying attachment in animals, found that rat moms soothe their pups by licking them. In securely attached mom-pups dyads, there's a lot of licking. Secure attachment licking reduces the pup's cortisol stress levels for the remainder of their lives. Maternal soothing helps the pups to become low on anxiety and aggression and to become parents who are themselves securely attached high lickers of their own offspring. In insecurely attached, no licking mom pup dyads, the pups have higher emotional reactivity and cortisol levels and become high anxiety, aggression, low licking parents who tend to have insecurely attached offspring who are themselves high on aggression and anxiety. High stress and poor stress regulation also leads to injury to telomeres, which are the bumpers on the cell's DNA. This leads to more rapid cell senescence and premature aging of organs, which is part of the mechanism for the increased morbidity and mortality with high ACEs. Home toxic stress that is caused by caregivers is far more damaging than community toxic stress. The ACE questionnaire consists of 10 questions. It is scored 0 to 10. The ACE studies led to some remarkable findings. In their relatively well-to-do population, the ACE studies found that 62% of adults had experienced at least one ACE, and 16.7 had experienced 4 or more. The most common ACE was emotional or verbal abuse, followed by parental separation or divorce, substance abuse by a household member, physical abuse, witnessing domestic violence, and having a household member with mental illness. 11.4% of the sample had suffered sexual abuse. The ACE study found that those with adverse childhood experiences were at a higher risk for heart, lung, and liver disease, obesity, diabetes, depression, suicide attempts, sexually transmitted diseases, cancer, stroke, COPD, and substance abuse. The higher the score on the ACE questionnaire, the more likely people were to be in poor health. The higher the ACE score, the more people life potential was negatively impacted as reflected in lower graduation rates, academic achievement, and more time on disability. The mechanisms for the increased morbidity and mortality that follow adverse childhood events have also been investigated. 50% of morbidity and mortality arising from ACEs is attributable to behavioral and lifestyle factors that are more common in these populations. High risk behaviors such as belonging to gangs, crime, unhealthy eating, smoking, substance use, etc. The other 50% is independent of behavior and lifestyle, so that even patients with high ACE scores that led healthy, low risk lives had significantly more morbidity and mortality than people with similar lifestyles with no ACEs. Kids who have 4 or more ACEs have 32 times the rate of learning and behavioral problems than kids with no ACEs. Many of them are misdiagnosed with ADHD and treated with stimulants. Social, academic, behavioral, and cognitive issues impair children's psychosocial development. Other adversities, besides the 10 listed in the ACE questionnaire, are also likely to lead to toxic stress. They include community violence, homelessness, discrimination, foster care, bullying, repeated medical procedures, life threatening illnesses, death or loss of a caregiver, and in teenagers, verbal or physical violence from a romantic partner, and incarceration. These stresses were not part of the ACE study. To watch a video on child-parent psychotherapy, please go to the website now. What do we know about how PTSD develops? PTSD is primarily a memory disorder. To understand why it is a memory disorder, we need to explore memory in greater depth. There are several types of memory. Each of the information centers, somatic, emotional, and rational, has its own memory system. The two broadest types of memory, which can be further subdivided into other subtypes, are explicit and implicit memory. 1. Explicit memory, or declarative, or representational memory, is the conscious, intentional recollection of factual information, previous experiences, and concepts. Explicit memory includes A. Autobiographical or episodic memories, and B. Semantic memories, which involves recalls of words, concepts, or numbers. Explicit memories of previous experiences are not indelible. Rather than permanent recording, our memory of events is more like a Wikipedia page that can be altered by us or other people whenever it is retrieved. 2. Implicit memory, or non-declarative, or procedural memory, does not require the conscious or explicit recollection of past events or information, and the individual is unaware that remembering has occurred. Implicit memory includes A. Priming, improved performance on tasks people have subconsciously prepared for. For example, word nurse recognized more quickly following word doctor than following word bread. B. Skills and habits, riding a bicycle, skating. C. Skeletal musculature, body memory, posture and body responses based on previous experiences. And D. Emotional responses, the effects that past emotional experiences bring to bear on present emotional responses to events in the environment. And this brings us into the dysregulated versus well-regulated emotions. To summarize the differences between implicit and explicit memories, implicit memory is associated with System 1, or the emotional brain, whereas explicit memory is associated with System 2, or the rational brain. Explicit memory is associated with the hippocampus and medial temporal cortex. Explicit memory is conscious and experiences images and words. Explicit memory is associated with mind. It is slow and takes effort. It is logical and involved with consequential decision making. Implicit memory is associated with the amygdala. It is unconscious and experienced as body feelings. It is associated with the heart. It's fast and requires no effort. It's automatic pilot and experience-based decision making. Explicit and implicit memory can be activated together or independently of one another. Post-traumatic spectrum disorders occur when traumatic memories are stored unprocessed in implicit memory. Remember that implicit memory express themselves in feelings, sensations, and dreams. They are unconscious somatic and psychological manifestations that are not expressed literally the way explicit memories are. Post-traumatic spectrum disorders occur when traumatic memories are stored, without being processed, in implicit memory. The somatic and emotional flashbacks, often seen in PTSD and emotional dysregulation, are often manifestations of unconscious implicit memories emerging spontaneously or being triggered by a present day event. To use a computer metaphor, when a traumatic experience occurs, a document is created which is then stored in computer memory. Triggers open that document on the screen, displacing other things the person may have been engaged in. To avoid that happening, the person starts to avoid more and more potential triggers. The healing of trauma spectrum disorders involves processing unprocessed implicit memories. Unprocessed traumatic memories or complexes are implicit memories that retain the unmodified emotional and physical memory of a traumatic event. Unprocessed or unresolved implicit unconscious traumatic memories are a feature of the traumatic spectrum disorders and a common cause of emotional dysregulation. People with unprocessed or unresolved traumatic memories often have dysregulated emotions, but rather than associating their reactions to past trauma, they attribute them to present day circumstances and people. Recognizing dysregulated emotions and understanding they may have as much or more to do with the past as with the present is an important step in learning to mentalize, which is being aware of what's going on inside of you. Sometimes the dysregulated emotions associated with unresolved trauma are misdiagnosed as the mood swings of bipolar disorder. Dysregulated emotions tend not to respond as well to treatment with medications as typical bipolar disorder. Dysregulated emotions are not a person's fault, but society holds them accountable for the results of these emotions, and ultimately it is up to the person to manage and change them. Recall that there are different states of physiological activation: hypoactivation, calm alert, and hyperactivation. Activation curves depict a person's changing states of physiological activation over time. These activation curves look quite different in people with well regulated versus those with dysregulated emotions. So, how does traumatic stress lead to PTSD? Traumatic stress leads to PTSD when an overwhelming stressor appears to be or is inescapable. If a person can't escape a traumatic event physically, they will escape mentally by dissociating from it and trying to safely encapsulate the traumatic memory as a dissociated traumatic complex. As we've seen, children are particularly vulnerable to traumatic stress because compared to adults, it's harder for them to escape and they don't have the resources or the cognitive or physical ability to leave their caregivers. When people dissociate from the traumatic event, they often go down into the brainstem and the reptilian brain and feel numb, dead, empty, in a void or bottomless hole. Less often, they go up and have a transcendental experience, such as a mystical near death or out of body experience. Unprocessed traumatic complexes are dissociated or exiled from the rest of the memory system in order to protect the integrity of the mind from the pain they carry. These dissociated traumatic complexes exist separately in the mind, but their maintenance requires a lot of mental energy, leaving less of it available for all the other functions of the mind, including psychosocial growth. When these traumatic complexes are triggered and activated, and the person goes into emotional mind, their energy requirements soar, leaving very little energy for any other mental function. This is called the limbic hijack. Much more on this when we discuss dissociation and internal family systems. When a person encounters a traumatic stress that takes them to the extremes of activation, either hypo or hyperactivation, but they are able to escape, PTSD is unlikely to occur. In contrast, when the traumatic stress is for some reason inescapable, the person cannot escape physically, they escape mentally by dissociating the memory of the event in the form of an unprocessed traumatic complex. Much of attachment trauma is inescapable. After all, the child cannot choose to leave their family. This is why attachment trauma is highly likely to lead to post traumatic spectrum disorders, such as complex PTSD. Does everyone who experiences traumatic stress develop PTSD? 6 different post-traumatic stress trajectories have been identified. These graphs depict how the level of distress and dysfunction of the person might progress starting from just before the trauma, labeled as pre-disaster, to just after the trauma, and then long-term. They are resistance, relapsing remitting, resilience, delayed dysfunction, recovery, and chronic dysfunction. One trajectory that's not depicted in the previous slide is post-traumatic growth. The 7 post-traumatic stress trajectories that we have mentioned fall into 3 outcomes: homeostasis, negative transformation, and positive transformation. Different outcomes can result from traumatic stress. Organisms are homeostatic in that they tend to return to a state of steady internal physical and chemical conditions. Most people who experience traumatic stress, 1, spontaneously recover and return to normal functioning. When the person's coping resources cannot fully deal with the traumatic experience, the person is 2, transformed. This 2A transformation can be negative, as in the post-traumatic spectrum disorders, or positive, as in post-traumatic growth. People can also experience a combination of post-traumatic stress symptoms and post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth refers to the positive effects that can result from a traumatic event. Commonly reported elements of post-traumatic growth include a greater sense of personal strength, increased exploration of existential questions like death and purpose, increased value placed on small things in life, changes in spiritual and religious areas of life, improved relationships, new possibilities for life, greater appreciation for life, and greater compassion for others. Post-traumatic growth is predicted by personality traits of optimism and religiousness. Post-traumatic growth tends to increase as more time elapses from the trauma. Post-traumatic growth and resilience. In post-traumatic stress disorder, the person's functioning is impaired following the trauma. People who are resilient can cope with the traumatic stress and return to the same level of functioning they had prior to the trauma. Post-traumatic growth can change people's patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving, that is, their personality, in a positive way. Just as there are risk factors for PTSD, there are a number of protective factors that predict resilience to traumatic stress and the likelihood of post-traumatic growth. These factors include social supports, positive role models, religion and spirituality, meaning and purpose in life, optimism, humor, gratitude, and a determination to face one's fears. What is mainstream psychiatry's success with treating the trauma spectrum disorders? Mainstream psychiatry has a poor track record for diagnosing and treating trauma spectrum disorders. One can go as far as to say that modern medicine and psychiatry have blind spots for trauma. There are some signs that this is improving. Let's briefly look at the history of this blind spot. Freud initially proposed that trauma of a sexual nature was the major cause of his patients' issues. Later, he rejected his own theory, replacing it with the Oedipal theory, which held that these memories were wishes or fantasies. The suppression of trauma dominated 20th century psychiatry, and traumatic causes for psychiatric symptoms were largely ignored. DSM-5 is 947 pages long and lists 297 disorders. Only 6 of those 297 diagnoses in DSM are classified as trauma and stress-related disorders, taking up only 25 of DSM's 947 pages. Of those 6 diagnoses, only 1 is occasionally made by psychiatrists, PTSD. Bessel van de Kolk, a psychiatrist, researcher, and one of the most respected traumatologists in the world, has said, despite the scant attention psychiatry pays to trauma, if you take every condition that is very significantly related to trauma out of DSM, you're left with a pamphlet. In 2012, despite much lobbying, the DSM-5 committee refused to incorporate complex PTSD into DSM-5, citing a lack of evidence. There are, of course, psychiatric conditions that are not related to trauma, and that may be mostly biological. Several factors may have contributed to this blind spot. Since the late 40s, there have been many pharmaceutical breakthroughs in psychiatry which have improved and even saved the lives of many people suffering from conditions such as major depression, anxiety disorders, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. Most psychiatrists follow a medical model and prescribe medications. Many are not skilled psychotherapists. The pharmaceutical industry heavily influenced psychiatric education. Most government healthcare programs cover psychiatrists, while few cover psychologists or psychotherapists. It takes a lot less time to make a diagnosis based on symptoms than to understand what causes the symptoms. Psychotherapy is more difficult and time consuming to learn and practice than pharmacotherapy. However, trauma and attachment based issues are very common and don't tend to respond well to medications. People with attachment and trauma related issues are sometimes or often not well served by mainstream psychiatry or the public healthcare system. They need trauma informed care. What is trauma informed care? Trauma is almost universal among people with lived experience of mental health and psychosocial difficulties. The single most significant predictor that an individual will end up in the mental health system is a history of trauma. Trauma informed healthcare providers ask, "What has happened to you?" not "What is wrong with you?" They are not judgmental, have a hope, acknowledge alternative views, are respectful, and avoid jargon. Healthcare providers skilled at working with people who have experienced trauma are good at self regulating and staying in the window of emotional tolerance, even when the people they are working with are very distressed. The concept of trauma informed care has arisen to try to counter the blind spot. The 4 Rs are the pillars of trauma informed care and describe the mindset necessary to provide appropriate care to people experiencing trauma spectrum disorders. The 4 Rs are realize the widespread impact of trauma and understand potential paths for recovery, recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved with the system, respond by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and resist re traumatization of children as well as that of adults who care for them. I've heard there are some controversies within the field of trauma. There are a number of controversies, challenges, and open questions in the field of trauma spectrum disorder studies. In the mid 1890s, Freud proposed his seduction theory. Hysteria is caused by repressed memories of early childhood abuse. He abandoned the seduction theory in 1897 for his theory of infantile sexuality, of which the Oedipal complex was the centerpiece. In a letter to Fleece, he gave his reasons. One, recovering these memories did not cure the patients as he had hypothesized. Two, his sister had hysterical symptoms and he couldn't accept his father had sexually molested her. Three, the unconscious can't tell fact from fiction. After Freud, psychology and psychiatry neglected developmental and attachment trauma until attachment theory started to shine a light on it again. Kaplan and Sadok's textbook of psychiatry, The Bible of Every Psychiatric Resident, in its 1980 edition, reported the rate of father daughter incest to be about 1 in a million, and held that it was generally a positive experience. In the 1980s and 90s, trauma was rediscovered. Books such as 1988, The Courage to Heal by Ellen Bass suggested that a wide range of psychiatric symptoms were indicators the person experiencing them had been sexually abused, even if that person had no explicit memory of any such event. Many therapists, inspired by this, revisited Freud's seduction theory and thought that to heal, people had to recover these memories. This led to the memory wars, which was marked by academic, public, and legal debates about the veracity of recovered memories. Recovered memories. A memory of a traumatic event, such as sexual abuse, experienced typically during childhood, that is forgotten and then recalled many years later. False memories refers to cases in which people remember events differently from what they happened, or in the most dramatic cases, remember events that never happened at all. The issue of recovered memories was associated with much grief and led to a flurry of police investigations, including some involving allegations of ritual satanic abuse. This led to a backlash spearheaded by the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, which was largely comprised of family members who maintained they had been falsely accused of sexual abuse. Some therapists were successfully sued, and some accusers retracted their stories. In other cases, corroboratory evidence was found to confirm the veracity of recovered memories. Some who were accused admitted memories were true. Memory has many different components, some more malleable than others. Different memory systems become functional at different stages of development. Somatic and emotional memory are operative from before birth, but explicit memory typically comes online at ages 3 or 4. Stress and trauma affect focus, attention, and memory. Explicit memory follows literal, material world, logical causality, and temporality. Implicit memory follows symbolic, dreamlike, imaginative logic, making no distinction between past from present or one person from another. False memories have been repeatedly experimentally implanted in people. Some recovered traumatic memories can't be corroborated. These include recovered memories of events such as alien abductions and ritual satanic abuse. These may be false memories underlying which there may be a traumatic core at the level of the somatic and emotional memory centers that is symbolically represented in cognition. Dissociation is real and a mechanism through which memories can be repressed. Most people who have been abused remember some parts of the abuse, but not others. Fewer don't remember any aspect of the abuse at all. Some people who have had traumatic experiences don't remember them at all, but in some situations have somatic and emotional flashbacks, for example, when having sex. From these flashbacks, they go on to reconstruct narratives of abuse. Many of these narratives have been corroborated. Recovering traumatic memories doesn't directly lead to healing. Trauma work can be done with somatic and emotional memories as they manifest in the present without trying to recover repressed memories. My sense is that therapists should neither encourage nor discourage the recovery of memories. If repressed memories emerge in therapy, therapists don't need to be certain whether these memories are true or false. They should, however, consider them to be deeply important and meaningful to the person and of help in understanding those people. As a society, we are becoming increasingly trauma aware, and there's more openness, acceptance, information, and various forms of peer support for people suffering from trauma spectrum disorders. We also have much more knowledge about trauma treatments. Unfortunately, professional services are sorely lagging behind public awareness and scientific knowledge. Trauma treatment can be long and complicated, and not many professionals are adequately trained to provide it. Access to and quality of care are problems for people who have experienced trauma. Those who may be trained are often not funded by public health care. Some of the controversies in the field of trauma include: to what extent are conditions such as chronic depression, anxiety, and ADHD genetic, related to stress, past trauma, or environmental factors such as economic factors, the educational system, nutrition, and social media? Does the word traumatic to refer to common everyday stressors trivialize trauma? Are our emotional immune systems becoming inept because childhood is so structured by parents, as, for example, argued in Jonathan Haidt's The Coddling of the American Mind? Are we increasingly becoming a victimhood culture, one which divides people into two groups, the privileged oppressors and the underprivileged oppressed? Victims oppressed are given the moral high ground and must be defended from oppressors. Oppressors are identified on the basis of race, gender, socioeconomic, and educational status. Microaggressions are seen as rampant and to be dealt with by strategies such as the creation of safe spaces and counseling. To watch a video entitled Why Doctors Ignore Trauma, please go to the website now. On the PowerPoint presentation that you will find on the website, there is a review and practice component that covers the tools, techniques, and strategies that we have previously covered in the Simple course. Looking over those slides will help you consolidate the material. Let's look at the homework for this session. Thank you for being with me today, and see you next session.